What happens when a liberal professor tries to publicly humiliate a guest lecturer she despises, only to realize she just challenged one of the greatest technological minds of our generation? Trust me, by the end of this story, your jaw will be on the floor. Let me tell you exactly what happened, but first let me know in the comments where you're watching from. In one of America's most prestigious universities, Professor Eleanor Wright's advanced theoretical physics class was known for two things: her brilliant scientific mind and her increasingly obvious political agenda. As students filed into the grand lecture hall that morning, there was already a palpable tension in the air. The whiteboard wasn't filled with the usual complex equations, but instead displayed a simple message. Today's topic: re-examining scientific privilege in modern physics. In the back of the packed auditorium sat a casually dressed man in a simple black t-shirt. Few of the students knew he was coming. This visit had been arranged by the department head as a surprise guest lecture on practical applications of theoretical physics in industry. But everyone instantly recognized him: Elon Musk. What they didn't know was that behind his entrepreneur persona lay a physics mind that would soon shock everyone in that room. In today's world, she continued, her voice carrying a hint of condescension, we need to focus less on abstract theories developed by privileged individuals and more on democratizing science for social good. The silence in the room grew heavier as she pulled up a PowerPoint slide. Instead of the promised physics materials, it showed statistics about wealth disparity and scientific advancement. Some of you, she said, her gaze drifting meaningfully towards Elon, might need to accept that your position in the scientific community doesn't necessarily reflect merit alone. Elon's hand remained raised, steady and patient. Other students began glancing back at him, then at each other. A few nodded slightly, seemingly grateful that someone was willing to speak up. Professor Wright began her lecture with her usual confident stride, but something was different. Her movements seemed almost aggressive as she paced before the class. Physics, she declared, while important, must acknowledge its role in perpetuating systems of power and privilege. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats as she continued outlining her view on how scientific objectivity was a myth. Elon's hand slowly rose into the air. The professor's eyes narrowed slightly. She hadn't expected any challenges to her authority today, especially not from the controversial billionaire who had been thrust upon her class. Professor Wright's lecture quickly evolved from a discussion of physics into something more revealing. But before acknowledging him, Professor Wright continued, her voice growing more pointed. For instance, she said, clicking to the next slide, private wealth and connections can create artificial advantages in scientific innovation. The implication wasn't subtle. A few students turned to gauge Elon's reaction, but his expression remained composed, his hand still raised. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Professor Wright couldn't ignore him any longer. Yes, Mr. Musk, she said, her tone carrying a mixture of irritation and amusement. Do you have something to contribute to our discussion about privilege and scientific advancement? The room fell completely silent. Everyone knew about Elon's companies and his controversial public statements, but few knew about his deep knowledge of physics principles that guided his engineering breakthroughs. As he slowly lowered his hand and began to speak, nobody could have predicted what was about to unfold in that classroom. Elon's voice was measured and respectful as he spoke. Professor Wright, I believe physics is fundamental to understanding both our universe and solving humanity's greatest challenges. Many of these students chose this advanced class specifically to deepen their understanding of theoretical concepts. He paused briefly. Wouldn't reducing the core scientific curriculum potentially disadvantage everyone who wants to contribute to innovation, regardless of their background? Several students nodded in agreement, but Professor Wright's expression hardened. Mr. Musk, she said, emphasizing his last name, perhaps you could benefit most from understanding how privilege shapes scientific advancement. After all, not everyone can fund their own space program or electric car company when their theories don't find academic support. What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of becoming defensive, Elon smiled gently. You're right about one thing, Professor. I have been extremely fortunate in my access to resources. That's precisely why I believe we have a responsibility to ensure the core principles of physics remain accessible to everyone. so they too can reach their full potential. The professor's face flushed. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected. And you think you know better than your academic colleagues about maintaining scientific standards? Her voice dripped with sarcasm. Tell me, what makes you such an expert on physics education? I'm not claiming to be an expert on education, Elon replied calmly. I'm just someone who believes in the transformative power of physics knowledge and its ability to transcend political divisions. He gestured toward the equation-free whiteboard. Instead of debating privilege, couldn't we spend this time exploring the beautiful complexities of theoretical physics that could inspire the next generation of innovators? The class held its breath. Professor Wright's eyes narrowed dangerously. She walked slowly to the whiteboard, marker in hand. Very well, Mr. Musk, she said, the challenge evident in her voice. Since you're so passionate about physics, let's put that passion to the test. She began writing on the board, her hand moving quickly, crafting something that made several graduate students gasp as the equation took shape. Even the most confident students in the room felt their stomachs sink. This wasn't just any physics problem. It was the kind of complex quantum mechanics calculation that even doctoral candidates would struggle with. But what Professor Wright didn't realize was that she had just opened a door that would change everything. The equation she wrote sprawled across the board, a quantum field theory problem involving path integrals and symmetry breaking mechanisms, was meant to silence the unwelcome guest. Since you're so concerned about maintaining standards, she said with a smirk, why don't you show us how it's done? Unless, of course, you'd prefer to discuss your privileged background instead. The challenge hung in the air. Several students shifted uncomfortably, recognizing this as a clear attempt at public humiliation. One student even whispered, "That's beyond our doctoral program." But Elon's expression remained unchanged, his composure unwavering. "Of course," he said quietly, standing up. "I'd be happy to try." As he walked toward the front of the room, Professor Wright's smirk widened. She'd chosen this problem specifically because it required techniques that went far beyond the scope of their current coursework. Techniques that only someone deeply immersed in theoretical physics research would know. But something in Elon's calm demeanor made her smile falter slightly. He took the marker she offered, studying the equation with genuine interest, rather than the fear she'd expected. A few students leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. "Before I begin," Elon said, turning to face the class, "I notice this problem has multiple possible approaches. Would you prefer I use the standard Feynman path integral method? Or would you be interested in seeing a more efficient solution I developed while working on quantum neural networks for my AI projects?" Professor Wright's expression froze. The casual reference to advanced quantum computation techniques caught her off guard. "You've developed a new approach to path integrals?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Yes," Elon replied simply. "The standard formulations didn't scale well for our quantum computing simulations, so we had to get creative." He turned back to the board, marker poised. "But perhaps we should let the physics speak for itself." The silence in the room deepened. Professor Wright's challenge had just taken an unexpected turn, and as Elon began writing his first line of solution, no one, not even the professor, could predict what was about to unfold on that whiteboard. Students watched in stunned silence as Elon's hand moved across the whiteboard with practiced precision. Each step was clear, deliberate, and surprisingly elegant. But what truly caught everyone's attention wasn't just his solving of the problem, it was his running commentary. "This first step," he explained calmly, "uses a technique Richard Feynman developed in the 1950s. His marker continued moving. "It simplifies what appears complex into something more approachable through a dimensional transformation." Professor Wright's confident expression began to waver as she followed his work. Between steps, Elon would pause briefly, ensuring the entire class could follow his logic. It wasn't just about solving the problem, he was teaching it. Several students had pulled out their phones, recording his explanation. Even those who usually struggled with quantum mechanics found themselves understanding his approach. "Now," he said, reaching a crucial point in the solution, "we have two paths forward." He turned to Professor Wright. "The traditional academic method would take another full board, but there's a more elegant approach using quantum symmetry principles that we've employed at our quantum computing division. Which would you prefer to see, Professor? Professor Wright stood frozen, her earlier smugness completely evaporated. The question wasn't just about mathematical preference, it was a gentle reminder of the depth of knowledge she had tried to dismiss. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, something unexpected happened. A hand shot up from the middle of the class. Could, could we see both? Asked David Chen, one of the quieter doctoral students. This is actually helping me understand the connections between theoretical principles and practical quantum computing better than anything I've read. Elon smiled warmly at David, then looked questioningly at Professor Wright. The professor's response would reveal far more than just her scientific preference. It would show whether she could recognize when a teaching moment transcended her personal biases. Just as Professor Wright was about to respond, the classroom door burst open. Dean Harrington, a known supporter of Professor Wright's political activism, strode in. Eleanor, he announced, we need you for an emergency faculty meeting about the new department funding priorities. The timing couldn't have been worse for Professor Wright, or better, as she thought. We'll have to continue this demonstration another time, she said, trying to regain control of the situation. But before she could step away, Elon spoke up. Professor, he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made even the dean pause. You challenged me to solve this problem in front of everyone. Walking away now would teach an unfortunate lesson about scientific integrity. The class erupted in murmurs. The dean's face reddened. Sir, are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Elon interrupted politely but firmly. I'm stating a fact. Professor Wright issued a public challenge to prove a point about privilege and merit. I accept it. The only question is whether she'll honor her own challenge. The tension in the room was electric. Several students had pulled out their phones, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Professor Wright looked trapped between her ally and her own actions, while the dean seemed unsure whether to assert his authority or back down. Then Elon did something unexpected. He handed the marker back to Professor Wright. Or perhaps, he said with a slight smile, you'd prefer to show us your solution first. After all, as you mentioned earlier, connections shouldn't matter. Only knowledge should. And surely, as the professor of this advanced class, you can solve this problem you've presented. The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Wright stared at the marker in her hand, suddenly realizing she'd walked into a trap of her own making. The dean's presence no longer felt like a rescue. It was another witness to what was about to unfold. The atmosphere in the classroom was charged with tension as Professor Wright gripped the marker, her knuckles turning white. The dean shifted uncomfortably, sensing this was no longer a simple classroom dispute. Students held their breath, phones still recording, knowing they were watching a defining moment unfold. I. Professor Wright started, then stopped. Her hand trembled slightly as she looked at the complex equation she'd written. The same equation she'd chosen specifically to humiliate a guest was now a sword hanging over her own head. Perhaps, Elon offered graciously, we could solve it together? Sometimes collaboration leads to better understanding. His tone held no mockery, no triumph, only a genuine offer to transform this moment of conflict into something constructive. But Professor Wright's pride wouldn't let her accept the olive branch. This is ridiculous, she snapped, throwing the marker down. This entire display is nothing but a privileged tech billionaire trying to undermine academic authority. The dean, sensing disaster, tried to intervene. Let's all take a step back. No, Elon said firmly, picking up the marker. Let's take a step forward. He turned to the board and, in a display of physics virtuosity that left the room speechless, completed both solutions, the traditional method and his quantum computing approach, in under 10 minutes. As he wrote the final line, the class erupted in spontaneous applause. Even the dean couldn't hide his amazement. But what happened next would reshape the entire dynamic of not just this class, but potentially the entire department. Professor Wright's face had gone from red to pale, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling before her eyes. But Elon wasn't finished, and his next words would prove that true leadership isn't about winning arguments, but about building bridges. Elon turned away from the board, facing both Professor Wright and the dean. The beauty of physics, he said, is that it doesn't care about our politics, our backgrounds, or our biases. It only cares about truth. He gestured to his solutions. These equations tell us something important, not just about quantum mechanics, but about learning itself. When we let our preconceptions cloud our judgment, we miss opportunities to grow. The dean cleared his throat. Mr. Musk, while your physics abilities are impressive, you must understand that what? A voice rang out from the back of the classroom. It was Jessica Rivera, a scholarship student who rarely spoke up. That we should learn less physics because of someone's political agenda? Other students began standing up. I came here to learn quantum mechanics, another called out, not to be lectured about my supposed privilege. Professor Wright's carefully constructed classroom control was unraveling. But instead of letting her face further humiliation, Elon did something remarkable. Professor, he said, loud enough to quiet the growing dissent, your theoretical knowledge is extensive. I've read several of your papers on symmetry, breaking in quantum field theory. They were influential in some of our early quantum computing work. The admission seemed to catch everyone by surprise, even Professor Wright. Perhaps, Elon continued, we could focus on that shared passion for understanding the universe. I'd be happy to discuss how theoretical work like yours is being applied in industry, creating opportunities for students from all backgrounds. The offer hung in the air, a chance for Professor Wright to save face while actually improving the class. The dean watched intently, realizing this moment could either explode into a PR nightmare or transform into something surprisingly positive. Professor Wright looked at Elon, then at her students, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time. What she saw in their faces would force her to make a decision that would change everything. Professor Wright's voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. She started, then straightened her shoulders. I've made a mistake. The admission seemed to cost her, but something had shifted in her demeanor. For years, I've been so focused on fighting perceived privilege that I became exactly what I claim to oppose, someone who judges based on preconceptions rather than merit. She looked at Elon. You didn't just solve that equation. You taught me something about true scientific inquiry. The dean stepped forward, sensing an opportunity. Perhaps this could be a model for other departments? But before he could spin this into an administrative win, chaos erupted outside the classroom. A crowd had gathered in the hallway, students from other classes who'd seen the viral videos being posted in real time. Some were holding signs hastily made with notebook paper. Teach physics, not politics, and merit over bias. The situation was about to spiral out of control, but once again, Elon stepped up. Walking to the door, he addressed the growing crowd. If you're here because you want to learn, he said, his voice carrying a natural authority, then come in. There's plenty of room. Students flooded in, filling every available space. Professor Wright watched in amazement as Elon turned back to the board, marker in hand. Now, he said, who wants to learn about how theoretical physics is being applied to solve humanity's greatest challenges? What happened in that classroom over the next hour would become university legend. But the real story wasn't about equations or politics. It was about something far more powerful that was about to unfold. The story of what happened in Professor Wright's theoretical physics class spread like wildfire across campus, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of becoming a tale of conflict and humiliation, it transformed into something far more powerful. In the weeks that followed, attendance in the advanced theoretical physics class tripled. Students weren't just coming to learn physics, they were coming to witness a remarkable partnership. Professor Wright, humbled by her experience, returned to her true passion for theoretical physics. And Elon, true to his word, arranged for regular virtual guest lectures connecting theoretical concepts to real-world applications. But the most surprising change wasn't in the curriculum, it was in the culture. The class became known as a place where questions were welcomed, where merit truly mattered, and where learning transcended political divisions. Students who had once felt intimidated by both the subject and the atmosphere now found themselves excelling. One day, as Elon was finishing a virtual guest lecture on quantum computing applications, Professor Wright approached the camera. You know, she said, You could have destroyed my career that day. Instead, you helped transform it. She paused, then added, not many billionaires would have shown that kind of grace. Elon's response reflected wisdom beyond his entrepreneurial success. The goal was never to tear anyone down, Professor. It was to lift everyone up. We're all trying to understand the same universe. Today, that physics class serves as a reminder that true education isn't about power struggles or political agendas. It's about the pursuit of knowledge, the courage to stand up for what's right, and the wisdom to do so with grace. And Elon Musk, he still makes time for virtual guest lectures, still helps connect students with opportunities, and still believes that the greatest privilege of all is the opportunity to learn and to help others do the same. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments what you thought about this episode. See you in the next video.